In 1776, our founders, in writing the Declaration of Independence, laid claim to something very radical. It was radical in 1776, and it's radical today. It was a repudiation of aristocracy. And aristocracy and monarchy had dominated Western civilization for centuries. The idea, we were taught this when we were children, was that God had given all rights to the king, the divine right of kings. And the king shared his power, or the queen's power, with their rich friends, the aristocracy. And this small group of people were entitled to everything. They were entitled to the land, and they were entitled to education, and they were entitled to make their dreams come true. They were entitled to do whatever they wanted to do. Nobody else was. The vast, vast majority of people could not have those means of self-actualization. They could not own land, they could not be educated, they could not create wealth, and they could not bequeath whatever they had created to their children. With the founding of this country, we turned that entire paradigm on its ear. And in the Declaration of Independence, it was declared that all men are created equal. All men. And that all men are given by God inalienable rights of life and of liberty and of the pursuit of happiness. And the Declaration says that governments are instituted among men to secure those rights. Now, those words are profound. And if all they are written on marble walls, inscribed on marble, or written on parchment and kept behind glass that we go see in a museum somewhere, that doesn't mean much after a few generations, because they lose their moral force. In the Jewish religion, it is said that every generation must discover God for itself. Every generation of Americans must rediscover for ourselves, what those words mean. Because only if we rediscover for ourselves in our own hearts what they mean, do they have moral force. Because only then do the people of the United States find and refine our emotional and psychological and moral and spiritual connection to those principles. Only then do we find that place in ourselves where we are willing to stand for those principles, to struggle for those principles, to know when those principles are being transgressed against, and to be willing to rise up and say, stop right there when somebody's coming after it. Now, that's where the story began, but as we know, it gets gnarlier and gnarlier. Because 41 signers of that declaration, it's so ironic because these men, by signing that declaration, were themselves committing treason against the King of England. If the war had gone differently, if the British had won, then the men who signed the Declaration of Independence would have been hanged. They would have been executed as traitors. So they knew they were risking their lives to sign it. So on one hand, these men gave this extraordinary gift to all of us and infused the founding of our nation with the most enlightened principles that had ever informed the founding of a nation in history. But 41 of them were slave owners. So that's how it all began. The tension was there at the beginning. The dichotomy was there at the beginning. The polarity was there at the beginning between the fact that on one hand, there are these extraordinarily enlightened, extraordinarily illumined principles, radical in nature, extraordinary in what they mean in terms of the possibilities for humanity to soar, for any person to soar, that any person could have rights to be who they want to be, do what they want to do, actualize whatever their God-given potential, and that government would not lord over them, but that government would be there to support those rights. We have been that, we aspire to be that throughout our history, and yet, from our very beginning, we have also contained as a nation people and forces which have and who have directly transgressed against those principles. That was there in 1776. It has been there in every single generation. The narrative of American history is that at every time in our history, there have been those whose hearts were ablaze, who did grasp, people who understood how extraordinary a gift it is to us and to the entire world, that there should be a country founded on the notion that all should be able to self-actualize and that nobody should stand in their way. And in every generation, there have been those who said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to have slavery. We're going to have genocide. We're going to have segregation. We're going to have oppression of women. We're going to have institutionalized white supremacy. In every generation, there have been the foes of democracy. And in every generation, there have been those who stood up and said to those foes, you stop right there. And the narrative of American history is that ultimately those who truly love democracy and are willing to stand for democracy and are willing to sacrifice for democracy have won the day. Because we answered slavery with abolition. And we answered the suppression of women with two major waves of feminism and the women's suffragette movement and the passage of the 19th Amendment. We answered the institutionalized white supremacy of the American South and segregation with the civil rights movement. This is not new, ladies and gentlemen, what's happening in our time. This stuff has just come back around again. Once again, we have the foes of genuine democracy. We have those who find real democracy rather inconvenient to their financial purposes. And that's why we don't have universal health care, because God forbid it should cut in to the short-term profits of health insurance companies and big pharma. And we don't have proper gun safety laws because God forbid it should cut into the short-term profits of gun manufacturers. And we don't fight climate change the way we should. Why? Because it might cut in to the short-term profits of fossil fuel companies, and we don't wage peace. We just prepare endlessly for war. Why? Because otherwise, God forbid, it might cut in to the short-term profits of defense contractors. Ladies and gentlemen, this is nothing new. This is just aristocracy again. We're not functioning, you see, as a democracy. We're functioning as a veiled aristocracy. Money's good. We like money. The problem in America is not that people can get rich. It's good that people can get rich in America. The problem is that today, not enough people can get rich. There is a difference between wealth and aristocracy. Wealth means, and many people in America have made great amounts of wealth and have done so righteously. Aristocracy is something different. Aristocracy is where the government functions in such a way as to advocate for the ability of very wealthy people to get even wealthier and make it harder for anybody else to create wealth at all. This kind of tendency is not good for democracy. Louis Brandeis, the late Supreme Court Justice, said that you can either have large amounts of money concentrated in the hands of a very few, or you can have democracy. The foe of democracy today isn't conservative and it isn't liberal. The foe of democracy today is corporatist. The foe of democracy today is that force which mitigates against Abraham Lincoln's statement that a government of the people and by the people and for the people would not perish from the earth. Ladies and gentlemen, it's perishing. Because we are functioning as a government of a few of the people, by a few of the people, for a few of the people, of the corporations, by the corporations, and for the corporations. This is so much bigger than how it affects you. It's so much bigger than how it affects you, and it's so much bigger than how it affects me. It's whether or not we as a generation stand up for this extraordinary possibility of a society in which the values of equality and the values of equal opportunity and the values of the real right of all people to pursue their happiness is something that is safe in the hands of this generation. We're not the first generation to have to face some very, very serious threats to our democracy. Let's just be sure we're not the first generation to wimp out on doing what it takes to get this country back on track. And that is what we have to do this campaign season. We will not win in 2020 just because we say to people, well, you know, you have the right to do universal health care. We're not going to win this year just because we say you have the right to $15 an hour minimum wage. We're not going to win this year just because we say you have the right to go to college for free. And we're not going to win this year just because we say you have the right to have those college loans canceled, all of which I believe in. But we have to come from a deeper place than just saying you have the right to those things. We need to come from the place where we claim for ourselves the responsibility, not just the rights of democracy, but the responsibility to take a stand for what all those things stand for. It's what universal health care stands for. It's what that $15 an hour minimum wage stands for. It's what free college stands for. It's what the cancellation of those college loans stand for. It stands for the right of people to soar, the right of people to relax, the right of people to have this cap taken off their dreams, a right of people to have their own power unleashed. That is where economic good comes from in this country. And it's time for us to learn to guffaw in a very healthy way when the enemies of our democracy tell us that our democracy has been eroded because those things which have eroded it are somehow good for business. None of that's good for business. I think after 40 years, the jury's in. So this trickle-down economic theory, which said, give all the money, take all the money through tax cuts, take all the money through subsidies, take all the money through canceling Glass-Steagall, do all these things to make it really easy for just a few people, a few corporate interests and a few very, very wealthy people to turn this government into their personal playground, turn it into their private piggy bank. And you see, we were told this would be really good for business because then all the money would just trickle down. And all that money trickling down, you see, it would lift all boats. Yeah, it's lifted all boats. Like hell, it's lifted all boats. It has left millions and millions of people without even a life vest. It has destroyed America's middle class. It has created the biggest wealth inequality since 1929. It has left a situation in this country where 40% of all Americans struggle just to make, the food costs and rent costs and transportation costs and health costs. Millions of Americans live with chronic economic anxiety. Millions of Americans who really just want to know that they can retire with dignity. Millions of Americans who really just want to know that they can take their kids, send their kids to college. Millions of Americans who just want to take their families out to dinner every once in a while a few people don't have to worry about anything more significant than their stock options. You know what, ladies and gentlemen? That's so wrong. That's so undemocratic, and you and I simply shouldn't take this shit.